We live in a world where every library, every framework nowadays is made to abstract the hard work and make it easier for developers to do stuff. And the Prisma ORM library does exactly that. It abstracts the SQL with object-oriented mapping. And that is why Prisma ORM was one of the most used ORMs out there. Okay, but wait a second, what actually is an ORM? And what is this tool for? And is it actually good to use tools like this? Well, in today's video, I'm going to be talking about Prisma ORM, what it is, why it's useful, and some of the downsides that have been coming out lately. So stay tuned while we dive deep into this. Object relational mapping is a technique that lets us query and manipulate the data from our relational database using object-oriented paradigm. And whenever people talk about an ORM, what they actually mean is a library that implements this object relational mapping. And an ORM library is a library written in a language we use, for example TypeScript, that encapsulates the code that actually interacts with the database, so we don't actually use SQL anymore. We can write object-oriented paradigm to interact with the database, and the ORM library handles the rest. And Prisma ORM is one of the more popular, or it was one of the more popular ORMs out there for JavaScript and TypeScript. And this actually consists of multiple parts. We have the Prisma client, the Prisma migration system, and the Prisma driver. And using Prisma is very easy. Essentially, we just need to install Prisma in our project. We need to define our schema using the Prisma schema language and generate the Prisma client. When we start using this in our project, we can either download the schema for our database if you already have one, or we can start from scratch. And we actually need to set an environment variable with the database URL that lets Prisma connect to our database. And that looks something like this. We have PostgreSQL. This is my database is PostgreSQL. So I have a PostgreSQL with this is the user, this is the host, and the database. And the Prisma schema looks something like this. We have a generator for the client and data source database. This is the config used by Prisma to understand what kind of client does it need, for which language, and what kind of database is used. And then we have all of our models. Now they have their own schema language, like I already said. And for me, it's very intuitive to use this one. It looks something like the actual SQL schema, but obviously it's a bit better. And these models are actually type safe. So when we generate the client, we can interact with these objects and know what the result is going to be, what the relations are between the objects, which is one of the biggest tools and biggest advantages for Prisma. And the way we use the Prisma client is we import the Prisma client, we create a new instance, and then we can use the client to find many, or we can add some queries in here to say where the user ID equals to something. We can ask for certain relations to be added to the response. And like I said, this is type safe, so I don't actually, so if I look at my ingredients model, you see I have meal ingredients or a grocery list, so I can ask for grocery list. You can see this popping up here, and this will include any relations for my ingredients with the grocery list table. And all of the models exist here, so I can ask for the user, and we can see essentially all of the models in here, which I love. Now, to actually understand how Prisma works is, Prisma has their own driver in between the code and the database, and this is called the Prisma driver. And any code we write is going to be executed on this driver, which converts our code into SQL and then manipulates that or fetches data from the database and returns it back. And obviously there's advantages and drawbacks to that, which I'm going to touch on a bit later. And the other great thing that Prisma has is the migration system. Now what this means is we can write our schema in code and we can commit this to our code version, and we can migrate the schema incrementally. And this means that if I want to add a new table, I can update the schema, generate a new migration, and run this migration on my dev server or my prod server or whatever, migrate, and this will update the schema once it's been migrated, and we'll have the new schema. And I think this is one of the safest way you can change your database schema. Essentially, we have version control. We can see the past versions. We understand what the changes are. We can also modify the data within. So I have user roles here, which is probably going to be a static table. And when I add a new role, I'm probably going to use migrations to do that. Or if I need to delete a role, I can also use migrations to do that. And honestly, having version control over my database schema has saved me numerous times in the past. And this is not the only tool that allows database migrations. Most of the database interaction tools allow this, like Next or Drizzle ORM or whatever. Now that we understand how this works and how we can set it up, let's talk about why these tools are useful. Now for me, the biggest benefit of the ORMs is the type safety. Like I already mentioned, we can easily see what our tables are, what the object that is being returned is, and easily connect this with any relational tables. And the other obvious benefit of using ORMs is not actually writing SQL. While I understand SQL and I can write SQL, I would much rather let Prisma handle all the left and right joins, and I just write object-oriented like syntax to get my data and connect all of my relations between the tables. And it's worth mentioning that setting up Prisma is very easy. Essentially installing the package, adding the database URI and the environment variables, and you can write your schema, generate, migrate, and use the client. And for me, it was easy as that. No need to set up anything. Everything was just working out of the box. And also their documentation is great. They have documented almost everything. It's very easy to find. Whenever I Google any problems or anything that I want to do with Prisma, the first thing that pops up is their documentation, which is great, which means that they realize what kind of problems people would have, and they have answer for that in their documentation, rather than getting that from Stack Overflow or ChatGPT. I'm gonna jump into the downsides in a bit, but while investigating Prisma, I realized they have logs, and it's very easy to set up logs in Prisma. So I'm gonna show that, and then we can go down and actually see some of the logs and why I'm doing those, essentially. I set up my own class called Prisma, and I have a static client here, so I can initiate the client only once and then use it. It's basically singleton class. So if the client is not initiated, initialize it and return it. But this is how we can set up logs. So these are events that are being emitted, and the easiest way to set up their logs is to put them at standard output. And this is just copied from their documentation. Like I said, they have great documentation. But the great thing is we can subscribe to events and do our own logging. So I'm subscribing to the event query here. So every time I query something, it's gonna go into this function, and I'm constantly logging a few things here. I'm only interested in the query for now, but essentially now, if I refresh my page, I can see these logs, which is great. That's all I want. So one of the biggest downsides to this particular ORM library is the performance. And it's great that it allows a lot of abstractions. You don't really care about, even if you don't know SQL, don't understand how it works, you can learn Prisma and use it. They have great code and great product and make great websites. But it's very important to understand how the tools work underneath the hood. I already mentioned that there's a driver in the middle of the code and the database. Now the way that this works is, so I have a model here called user roles, and this connects the user with the role, and I have a user ID and a role ID, and also I have relations here defined, which is basically the user based on the user ID and the roles based on the role ID. So this table should contain a user ID and a role ID, and I can connect those to the user table and the role table to get the actual objects. And if I do that here, for example, I want to get the user roles for the current user that's logged in, and I want to get the user object and the role object as well. Now, if I run this and I have some logs here, let's just clear all of this. And when this is actually executed, we can see that there's multiple queries executed for one result. And we can see that the same, I'm not sure if this is my issue by the way, but the same query is executed multiple times. We have the select ingredient, select user roles, select user, select roles. But even if the multiple times is my issue, this still tries to query each table individually. For example, get all user roles, then we get all users. It gets all user roles, then it gets the user with some ID, then it gets the roles with some ID. This makes 3 different queries, which could have been done with some joins. We don't actually know how many calls the driver is gonna make to our database, and that's one of the biggest downsides to Prisma and why it can be very unperformant and very costly as well. Imagine you're running this on a Lambda and you're being charged for the amount of interactions with the database and how many rows are actually returned. Because this is making multiple queries, it means that the driver is going back and forth with the database multiple times, so it's gonna run for longer than it should have. And because the way the Lambda is being charged is by the execution time, you're gonna be charged slightly more. And if you're being charged on the interactions between how many times you query something or how many rows are returned, for example, the getting the user roles, the whole table, when we actually need to get the entry with the user ID is the current user, that means it's getting more data than it has to. This could just have where ID equals 1 or something, whatever the user ID is for my current session. So you see the problem here, it's getting more data than it needs to, makes multiple queries, which is not very performant, and it can be costly. This was covered not too long ago, and since then there's been multiple other ORMs popping up on the scene, gaining attraction because they actually solve this problem and are more performant and not as costly. Like I already said, that I love using ORMs and I love abstracting away stuff and make my development actually easier. I don't want to write SQL, I don't want to worry about joins, I don't want to worry about what my database actually looks like, not having type safety. The value that they bring is great, but the performance issue with Prisma actually outweighs the pros for me. So even though I've used Prisma so far, I'm going to be looking for another ORM, probably making more videos about other ORMs as well, comparing them or whatever. And ever since other ORMs started becoming popular and solving this issue, Prisma has solved some of the performance issues, but we still see stuff like this. And I'm sure they're going to actually resolve this. I don't think it's that big of a problem to find a solution for, but we'll see how that plays out. But for now, those are my thoughts. And that's been it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any feedback, put it down in the comments below. Subscribe for more videos like this. Enjoy the rest of your day. Happy coding. Bye.